Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Harold Nelson back. This is part 2 of 3 of his presentation on his design flight school. Format: Harold is going to go through this presentation, about 19 slides or so, slide by slide. I will ask him some questions, maybe one question, or make a comment, quick comment with each slide, if I have anything to say, and then we will go to the next slide. If you have something to ask about the slide, go ahead and put it in the chat. And if it is something that is going to add to the conversation, I will go ahead and speak it out. All right, so that's the plan. And then once we are done with the presentation, we are going to have a Q&A. So keep track of all the questions that you have, and we'll go from there. All right, Harold, let's get started. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, everybody, for showing up. This time, as Shrikant said, the intention is to sort of say why it would be reasonable or a good idea to have a flight school now. And so, I mean, we'll talk a bit more later, maybe the third part, about the metaphor of what the design flight school, why it was used, the flight school idea. But anyway, I'm going to start building on the metaphor a bit right away. So if you desire to fly, it is important to know what you're doing for obvious reasons. And so it's not letting me.
You can go ahead and click on the slide and then hit.
Okay, got it. So anyway, the notion is that the design flight school is a really good idea right now for several reasons. And I wanted to go through those reasons, but it's going to maybe appear like I glance over the top of a lot of the ideas. And it doesn't mean that they're not really important or there's not a lot of depth to them, but it's obviously just a constraint of the time that we've got now. And this is just, again, kind of like one of those tourist buses where I'm driving around just pointing out some of the interesting sites that I invite you to go back and look at and explore in some depth. And we can talk about those at a later time. But anyway, I want to make a case that design flight school is a good idea. Part of it is that this notion of a design mind. And it's an important part of what makes us human. It turns out that the design mind predates modern humans, that our ancestors, our pre-modern ancestors even, showed this propensity to design things, to create things that augmented their lives in ways that improved and gave security and a lot of other positives. So wanted to talk a bit more about what that leads to. How do we find a way, a place to sort of gain access to the design mind and to allow it to grow and develop in all of us? So to continue a bit about from the notion of the design mind, and it's the thing that pulls us into the future and is this kind of attractive notion. And there's a lot of people have written about what this means for us. It's like, is it a constant dissatisfaction, or is it this sort of notion of the call that the hero of the thousand faces made? Or there's a lot of different ways that people have approached this, but this school is a way of sort of allowing the design mind to grow and develop and to actually work in the world. And part of that is that one of the first things that comes along is this notion of design intention. And intention, spelled with an S, is in this way is about direction. It's not outcome, it's about direction. And so the exciting, challenging thing is that systemic design is complex, difficult sort of field to get into. It doesn't have the simple kind of formulas and recipes that people have sort of grown attracted to. So anyway, for the flight school, we're going to take a right turn, and we're going to engage in complexity, which is a part of the tradition in systems, systemics, is that we're dealing with complex systems, environments, and that that's what we're going to do with the design school, is engage in that kind of complexity. Any questions?
No, I think this is a huge point, because many people will say, oh, design, I know everything about design. I've studied design. What this is saying is that that is only the figure. You're missing the entire ground, the context in which design takes place, why of the design. Most people just focus on the how. This is kind of looking at the larger picture of why do design, why are you doing design, and what's the largest context in which it is taking place. Please go on.
So this is a big point. I won't spend a lot of time on this, unfortunately, but this is a big point in the systemic design background, is that this is a postulate that sort of separates and distinguishes systemic design from the sciences and even the arts and humanities. And it's the fact, or the postulation, that description and explanation do not prescribe action, and prediction and control do not justify action, and design does both. So, like Hume, a philosopher, said or made the case that you cannot make an ought from an is, and people will try to do that. They'll work from data, they'll work from what they think is true, and then they'll try to make ethical judgments, decisions about what actions ought to take based on that. And you need a different way of working in the world than explanation and description. And almost all of the curriculum for universities, colleges, high schools are based on how we describe and explain the world. All our sciences, all our professions, all of that is description, explanation, concern of ethics, prediction and control, justifying action. And it's the ethics of technology. Technology can predict what's going to happen, and they have control over because of the instrumental knowledge that they have, but it doesn't justify action in itself. Just because we can control what we're doing or predict the outcomes, it doesn't justify it. So Riddle, one of my professors at Berkeley, who was the one that actually came up with the idea of wicked problems, introduced me and his other students to this term, German term, Sachzwang, and that means coercion by fact. And he said what happens, and it was the case in Europe and Germany and other areas, that there would be a paralysis that would set in around policy or taking action in the public realms, or even in business realms, but certainly in the public realms. There would be a paralysis, and the kind of strategy that would be used would be that people would start doing research, start collecting data, building more and more data, and it would grow and grow and grow, and all the statistics would be developed. And sooner or later, somebody would say, and therefore we should do this. And this is sort of what's gone on with the global warming conversation, is that there's a lot of data that's been collected, a lot of fact that's been developed. And those that collect that data, fact, do the research, then will say, therefore we need to do. But that means, and people catch it almost intuitively, that means that they've made a jump from being a describer and explainer, a scientist, if you will, or a professional. They made a jump from that to being a designer, a action-oriented person, and that they have some kind of right to do that, to make those decisions, because they have data and because they have truth. So that's this notion of coercion by fact, and it hasn't worked so far in a lot of these areas, and it won't work. So what's needed is this introduction, not the elimination of research as inquiry, but a introduction of other forms of inquiry that include search. Like, we have to be able to know how to engage in inquiry into what we would like, or what's a desirable outcome, so that or what's an ethical action to take. That's a different form of inquiry from research, and it doesn't replace research, but it needs to be research needs to be augmented by that, and that's what design does.
Wonderful. Let's go to the next slide.
So another design postulate, and this is sort of building up what's called a stance, that we're taking a stance. You're standing on what the postulates are, what your assertions are, what your assumptions are, what the values are. So this is another example of a postulate, and it's about degrees of freedom. And there's a lot of conversations nowadays, argumentation around whether or not there is free will, or where everything is deterministic. So in this case, the postulate says designers have a number of degrees of freedom, and we have free choice, we have free will, we have epistemic freedom, we have ontological freedom, so that we can choose what we want to stand on. What's our sort of bottom turtle, if you will? What is the common ground we stand on? And we can choose which direction we want to go in. Do we want to take the right turn, or we want to take a left turn? What direction do we really want to go? And but choose the form of inquiry. What kind of an approach do we have? Do we have just research, or do we have research, assessment, search, action? So we have the freedom to choose which one of those approaches to take, or all of them. And then we have the ontological freedom of choosing the purpose. What's the outcomes that we want to work towards? What is the final design, if you will, design products as we go along in the directions we're moving? What are those products, the outcomes that we want to see along the way?
Excellent. I think this is very significant. Regarding purpose as a variable that you choose, or the method, the epistemic method that you choose, or the direction or stance. I mean, that really, it's like looking at the water of other people's design. So please go ahead.
So an approach in all of this for this school is that systemics are the logics of design. And that means in some cases, systemic design and in systems thinking or design thinking or other areas, systems and design are kept separate as two different kinds of disciplines or two different fields. And in this case, for the school, systemics are the logics of design. So in design, you create connections, links, compositions, you put things together, And in systems and systemics, what you look at, describe, and explain and can understand is links, connections, bonds, all those sorts of things, so that actually in the designs themselves, they are explained by the kind of systemic in-betweens that are in place, so that you can't separate out systemics from designs. They're totally integral in this case, and it's the approach that's being taken.
Wonderful. Next slide, please.
So next approach, intention with a T, and intention with a T means purpose or outcome. What's the outcome that we're looking for as designers? And I wanted to talk a bit about practice. How do we get into the practice of systemic design? So one of the things, and this is just a transition, I'll just go ahead and go through this slide. One of the ways of beginning to make sense out of the practice of design is to use a metaphor. I'm borrowing this metaphor from a group of people that I know. Where the group is actually called Archipelago of Design. It's not exactly this, but the idea of how to talk about design as different islands that have a relationship. And what I've done is I've used a convenient island chain. Some of you may know it as the Hawaiian archipelago, but anyway, it fits very well this notion of the timeline or the evolution of design. People will try to give you the history of design at times, and usually that means going through different styles or something like that through the ages. And in this case, I'm using, I've used this notion of archaic design, communities of practice, ecologies of design that no longer exist, but still have some kind of effect on what we do. We still have a memory of those. And then there are the extant communities of practice, the ones that are a little older, a little more mature, but they're still operational, still fully functional. They've not been replaced. There is the nascent community of practice that's just coming into being now, and conveniently, the largest Hawaiian island is one of the most recent islands that's fully formed and has emerged, so that that in this case, in this metaphor, would be systemic design. It's emerged, it's making itself felt, it's being developed still and growing further, and it's the most recent one. So that's the one that'll be focused on for the school, is systemic design. But we have this notion of, oops, I didn't mean to jump ahead, sorry. We still have this notion of incipient communities that are just starting to hint at coming into existence. And there are types of designs that will be that will populate those islands or that island. Anyway, the one that's focused on for systemic design is the nascent one, the latest one, the most recent. And it's very convenient. You can see this timeline at the bottom of this map that will show you, and it shows, you know, the older islands are all worn down, and sometimes you can just see the very tips of them, or they're just very shallow, just slightly underwater. And we have a lot of those traditions, those design traditions that are like that. We can still sort of get influenced from them. We can still sort of see them and understand what they were, but they're no longer actively populated. They're not communities of practice any longer. Okay.
So firstly, I really like this metaphor because it it shows the timeline. You can see all the islands in one hand. If you're not aware of the history of them, they're all islands. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be that. So they're all the same. But moment you get into geology and you can see how islands come to be, and then there is a progression of it, it shows almost the kind of the genealogy of design.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great metaphor. Please go on.
It's very different from the way people give the history typically of what design is, or when they say what design is. So to kind of go down a bit and take a closer look, for example, the extant islands, at least the way that I've populated them, is that there are islands of craft where the materials are primarily the focus of what the designers are most interested in. There are islands of visual and experiential design, where it's the aesthetics that's primarily focused on, and how you create experiences or visual experiences through design. Then next, one of the most probably the most, I guess, influential island is transaction, where design is a process of creating products and services for sale, so that it's a business design. And there's the islands of scientized design, where design has been transformed into a sort of science, and that's more deterministic. And people believe that experimentation, for instance, and research primarily dominate in those communities. And there's the problematized islands of design, where design is defined as problem solving. And you probably have all run across articles or books where they will immediately say from the beginning, design problem solving, or somehow get that notion in almost immediately. So even though they may not, that they're on this problematized island in this archipelago of design. And then, of course, the systemic design population that is the nascent, the one that's just coming into existence now, has come into existence. And the future ones, the one I'm kind of interested in now that's coming further down the road, are the incipient islands of wide design and deep design. And I'll just talk briefly about those, but those are still kind of just an idea, just a kind of a glimmer.
Wonderful. Let's go to the next one.
So in this sort of genesis of design, I liked this particular image because it shows the kind of nascent island, the population of designers, and that the wide design and deep design are yet to make themselves appear. But the interesting thing, the nice thing that the Hawaiian Island chain has done for us is actually there's a new island that's forming just off Big Island, and that'll be the newest one. It's already coming up from the ocean floor, and it sort of helps in this whole metaphor. So anyway, that makes this notion of the genesis of design as something that's different. It's this idea that we don't have to reject all those other forms of design and say that this is design. I've heard people say that this is what it is. This is the definition. But in this case, it's like design this is where it is now in its evolution. And here are all these happy other successful islands where professionals are working. And again, the focus in the case for the school will be on the systemic design, the nascent island that has emerged.
Wonderful. I think the next two slides elucidate on this one, so let's go with them.
So The focus now, and they're related, try to make this case that they're related, is that the nascent, the systemic design piece is related to the ones that are coming or just beginning to emerge. So there'll have to be some kind of connection and link to them in the school. You can't sort of build a wall around just systemic design, that it has to look not only in its past, but it has to look into the future where it's beginning to develop. So this notion of systemic design focusing on relationships, links, connections, bonds, assemblies, compositions, emergence, all those things that we use, that we look for when we're looking at and explaining and describing a system or a systemic situation. And it's the things that designers intentionally put into place, that we put relationships and links and connections and bonds into place. So we get the compositions that we desire and the emergent qualities that we desire and the functional assemblies that we want. So it's both a way of seeing and a way of actually constructing our designs by using this notion of systemic design, keeping in mind that this notion of wide design, which is just there beginning to show, is that there is this expansion and embracing of other perspectives, other ways of seeing the world. So we don't just have science and the arts and humanities, but we can have political and spiritual and other kinds of traditions beginning to contribute to how we see design, how we engage in design, how we inquire in design. So there's this breadth, and it's big, it's huge. It's not just a few traditions out there, but it's things that we can't even imagine yet. There's territories that we can't imagine. And this notion then of deep design, that we go into designs, and I've worked a bit with this already around developing this notion of how do you get to all these, down to the very fundamental cause of why something comes into existence or why it has come into existence. So that as a design process, this is kind of a very fruitful way of approaching when you're actually engaging in design, is to engage in deep design to help you with systemic design.
Harold, let me ask you a little bit more about this wide and deep design. Can you've talked about wide as being the extent, like the breadth of kind of embracing more and more things. Can you speak a little bit more about deep? What does deep design mean?
Well, deep design, I mean, I'm pretty sure all of you, and I've used it to death myself, use this notion of the iceberg, of mostly the design work that we can see and experience, and the work that's done on most of the islands are the things that are visible and the things that we can touch and hear and feel. But for each design, when we look at it, we can begin to look at why that design came into existence in the way that it did. What was the reason? What was the, so what we can say is performance criteria, so that we have first the kind of prescription. How do you put things together? In particular, what's the kind of instrumental knowledge you need, and then what's the performance level that you're, and then you go down further till you come to this notion of what's the deep cause, what's the first cause for this, whatever the design is, what caused it to come into existence. And there's a lot more to that, but I've actually taken design projects of my own, and then I've taken other people through a process of going down and looking at the deeper levels of why a design, a building, or an automobile or anything has come into existence in the way that it has. And an interesting kind of side to that is I'll ask people to identify a design that they are very fond of, that they've taken a certain kind of ownership of, it's theirs. And to do the same thing, go through and find out why they have been attracted to and made that design a part of their life. And it's interesting because often their reasons are different from the reasons of the designers. That the designers will do things to bring something into existence and good reasons, but that people that embrace and make those things a part of their life have different reasons and different reasons for having connected with the design at deeper levels. And unfortunately, you can take some designs and begin to look at them deeper, and there's nothing there, or what they've done is they've borrowed somebody else's reasons for bringing things into existence, or you find that it's kind of rotten at the core when you get down into it, and it's not a good thing that's driving these things to come into existence. So not every design is a good design. A lot of designs come into existence that is just junk, and it shouldn't have been done, and it was done for all the wrong reasons. So anyway, this is a way of beginning to look deeper into why some designs are the way they are, and for the ones that are creating designs, what level do they need to go to in order to bring something authentic up into existence. And yeah, there's a lot more to that. It's been worked on a bit successfully, but a lot more to it.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's go to the next slide.
So one of the things about school that is kind of a challenge, not kind of a challenge, it's a real challenge, is that we're in what I would call the information age, which is a term that a Berkeley professor came up with in the 90s, was that the information age was replacing the industrial age. And in fact, the information age did replace it. The information age led to, of course, computer age which is kind of a subset of the information age, but then technology, AI, all of that's coming out of this notion of the information age. And the school is sort of founded on a paradigm that would support a systemic design age, which is different. It's a different way of looking at the world, what we want to be doing in the world. So if I can move to the next. So this will show this a little better, because this is really the tough piece. When somebody is in one paradigm and they're working from that paradigm, and they're working from what the assumptions are in that age, and you're trying to do some design work, you're trying to make some choices, decisions, going in new directions, they just don't understand what you're doing. And that's because you're probably working from two entirely different fundamentals. So the 20th century zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, was industrial enterprise. And this 1933-34 Chicago World's Fair motto, which is first science finds, second industry applies, and third man adapts. And I would say that's exactly what's in place now. That's what's going on right now. That's what people assume we do, so that money and attention goes into research and programs and STEMs and that are funded in order to create a science industry that will do the research that will give industry the basic information it needs to make products and services that they can then bring into the world, and then people have to sort of adapt to it. And that's exactly what's going on now. If you read anything about AI and the effects of nowadays, even chatbots that are coming out, people are a little frightened. They don't know if they can adapt or not. Or are we going to be totally overwhelmed? And is this kind of more than we can do? And others will promise, particularly from industrial sources, will say, no, this is a good thing. This is going to be the next thing, best thing since sliced bread. This is going to be. So this series, this hierarchy that's in place is in place today, very strong. And so the systemic design tradition is different. And if I can, is there any questions?
No, I think this is a very beautiful capturing of the core of thought here, saying that science finds mostly kind of material, finds things about the material world. Industry actually applies it. And then all that man is doing is adjusting to it. It's like he's being shaped by this other thing. But please go on.
Yeah. So the case for systemic design, and this grows out of not just me, of course, it grows out of a long tradition of people thinking about doing things differently. So even, Russ Akoff and others have talked about doing the right thing instead of just doing things righter, that you have to do both. And businesses now will sort of pick up on that. They'll give lip service to it a bit, but they haven't really changed the paradigm. So this is an example of what if you use the zeitgeist was around service to people. And it's part of what I was introduced to with Wes Churchman and Riddle and the others at Berkeley, and all their ancestors that they were bringing into this when they were talking about how to make an improvement in the human condition. How do you secure improvement in the human condition, which was what their zeitgeist was, is a very humanistic sort of focus. So in this case, for instance, the hierarchy would be people will express desired aims and outcomes. And then reason, science, will verify if that's viable. Can that actually be done, what you want? Is that actually based on any kind of reality in the material world? And then designers facilitate the innovation. They facilitate then bringing these desires and aims into existence, and it becomes a part of people's lives, so that the service piece is then people have expressed what they would like, and through a series of steps, the designers say, and this is how we can do it, and this is what it'll look like, and how it'll cost, and how long it'll take, and all the other sort of practical things. So this is maybe not the only one, but this is an example of a 21st century zeitgeist. And actually, when you're talking, even if you're sort of assuming that you want to do something better in the world, like nowadays, ESG, the notion of environment, social, and governance, that businesses are being asked to attend to, or the government is threatening to make businesses attend to it. It's in Europe and other places. They're trying to make business and governmental agencies that do good to be a service, but they're caught in the 20th century zeitgeist. They're not even aware, many of them, that there is the possibility of a new sort of paradigm, a new sort of spirit of the times around service. And that means changing fundamental belief systems, habits, all that. And the school would be a way of getting this perspective, this approach into the hands of professionals who can then get their clients, the people they're working with, colleagues, all the others, to become a part of what this expression would be versus the kind of product-based.
Wonderful. I love the starting point itself. You're starting with people. You're starting with human beings. So it's a design where the bottom turtle, if you will, is human beings with with everything about them, instead of them being the thing that is transformed finally. So it's a dramatic change in this hierarchy. Please go on.
So just a quick kind of aside, people talk to me, well, I'm working with this governmental agency, or I'm working in this business and they want me to do this, and I can't get them to understand. And 99% of the time is that their business is in the last century's zeitgeist, and what they're working from is the 21st century. And they can't even see what you're saying. They can't understand. I mean, it's just not part of their experience or their value system or anything. So it's sort of, how do you get people to a shared common ground and a shared appreciation of this new kind of emergent paradigm and how it gets expressed. So I just wanted to quickly go historically back. So it's not, this notion of a systemic design age isn't just me having too much time on my hands, but my experience, my introduction was that when I went to Berkeley for graduate school, I discovered that there was this group of scholars and professionals who had formed it in Berkeley, and they had this kind of common bond. They shared a common aspiration. It was a real life example of a self-organizing system. They all came together. They all, different disciplines and specializations, professional fields. They were highly acclaimed in their own fields. That's why they were at Berkeley. They didn't get hired to come to Berkeley because they were systemic designers, but they were very successful in whatever they were doing in their own professional domains or disciplines. And what happened was they influenced people all over the world, and that there would be scholars and practitioners who would come through the campus or who would use the work, the ideas, and the Berkeley group would also use ideas from people from all over the world, so that there were these influences that were going back and forth. And there was this notion that this was something that didn't form because somebody said, put a committee together, or the dread faculty committee, make a committee, pull it together and work on this systemic design stuff. It wasn't like that at all. This was something that people were brought together, pulled together because they had a common interest, common aspirations, and they had rules of relationship, engagement. They were very sort of collegial, open. They had dialogue, conversations, not the typical debate that you get at conferences and that, where people are trying to defend their beliefs around what's true. But anyway, they brought in this whole tradition of historical scholars and thinkers who had influenced them. And it's interesting because Wes Churchman, for instance, made the case that some of the earliest systems writing was in the Bhagavad Gita and in the I Ching and some of the very, very earliest writings, because they're about how things come together, how things fit together. There are systems, documentation, and a frame. So anyway, that's kind of one of the things that I experienced of the kind of attempt at a systemic design age emerging. And there's still those influences around, but the information age, of course, still dominates. But hopefully the school would create an environment where the conversations and the demonstrations could begin to point towards the value of a systemic design age.
Folks, Harold talked at length about the Berkeley bubble in the interview that we did, which is a separate video. This is very important because what this does is that it shows that it has been done before. You know, this kind of a community has been done before, and you can see the effects of it. The great thing is that it's easier to see things that have happened in the past, and using that as a reference, you can project what kind of a community would result by having a design flight school. Please go on.
So the next step, of course, once it's you figure, well, we want to do a flight school, is where do you get the agency for designing it? Who are you? And I get that question all the time, and designers will get it on, who are you to be the one that designs all this? So anyway, what happens over and over again in business and governments and other institutions, academic institutions, is that there are different kinds of paralysis that sets in and nothing gets done. There's analysis paralysis, value paralysis. People can't decide what kind of agency, who has agency, how we're going to move forward. So what designers do in every case is they have enabling judgments. And enabling judgments, or you make a judgment about, for instance, who are the clients? What's the project? What's the extent of the project? All those things that's necessary for any action to begin to take place. So in this case, for the school, the act was that surrogate clients came together, volunteered, saying, I want to be represent the clients of future generations of systemic designers, and to serve the intentions of past generations of thinkers and practitioners, and the desiderata, the desires of present and future generations. So not making the designer the client, but to pull a group out and say the surrogate clients are going to say, then these are the people that we want to serve, and this is the extent, and this is the project, and all those other things, so that saying that this is a systemic design based enterprise, and that it's working with the 21st century sort of foundation fundamentals, the different paradigm. Those are acts of enabling judgments around agency, which designers always have to do, because it's always open. Everything's open. And it's not always the case that somebody's going to come in and hand you a contract and say, I want you to design this for me. It's part of the notion. The design mind pulls us into projects that we would like to be involved with, that we think are important. And that, how do we then actively engage in that project, bringing it about? And this is the strategy in this case, is to allow the surrogate clients to begin to formulate what's called the design brief. What is it that is required, desired in this case, and around the school, so that bringing the systemic design thinking and action into the world, so it's a real thing, that we have practitioners that are actually doing systemic design, and we have people who understand it in the larger environment context. So this is a way to kind of get that started, get it going, and moving forward. So that's been done. Some of that has been done. It'll be ongoing, and refined and iterated. But right now, some of this has been cycled through as an example.
Thank you. So folks, this is the second of the 3 presentations. The details of how of the school we're going to do in the 3rd presentation. So don't miss that one. But let's go on.
So having cycled through and gone through the decisions about what kind of design brief or what the design brief is going to look like. And there's a lot of documentation available that I can share with people, would like to share with people anyway, about how that's come along. And there are people now that are coming in to be a part of this that will begin to look at and refine it. But anyway, one of the earlier in the present party, and the party is the general organizing idea, the concept that a designer gets, a team or a cohort gets. So in this case, what this is the notion of a center, and kind of keeping in mind that notion of the self-organization that was apparent at Berkeley around how they, what I call the Berkeley bubble, how they came together and they developed their own rules of relationship with one another, and how something much larger emerged from that. So in this case, nothing exists outside of an environment. And if you don't have an environment that's friendly to your system, to what you're trying to do, your design, then it's not going to last very long. So the focus here is to create what's called an academy, which are made up of the champions and the guardians and the people who are interested in seeing the idea and the goals and the mission of the school get through, and kind of work at the edges of the rest and competing environments. So that's what the academy is. Then there's an institute, and we're pulling people together now to be participants in the institute, which are the instructors, the mentors, the cohorts, the alliances, specialists, others who would help run the school at some point. But the institute is also a place for people to have conversations, or scholar practitioners to have conversations amongst themselves. That's kind of what I call the old notion of the coffee house. The old days, 2 centuries anyway, the coffee house used to be the place where people came together to talk about ideas. So that that's where ideas for constitutions for new countries and things would come from, and new philosophies, and that would come from this notion of the coffee house. So this institute is that place where we would sort of develop our own scholarship and our practices, and together in this kind of collective. And that would then be brought into the school. And the school will talk about what its particular structure is. The point in this case is that the center isn't a thing aside from all the rest of this. The center is something that emerges from the interaction of the academy, the institute, and the school. It's like automobile doesn't exist outside of tires, batteries, the engines, transmissions. Automobile only emerges when all those things are together, and it becomes an emergent quality. And none of the parts can operate as automobile by themselves. The tires can't be automobile by themselves. This is all something that Russ Ackoff, an example Russ Ackoff uses a lot when he's trying to explain to people why you can't sort of optimize a part in a system and think that you're going to fix how the rest of the system works. So all these things working together, interacting, this thing that emerges, the self-organization, will be the center. and the Design Flight School is an essential, necessary part of it, but it's not a separable part from it all.
Wonderful. Thank you. So folks, we are now going to the final slides. If you have questions, please go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Let's go to the final slide.
So just to sort of begin to wrap this up, the systemic designer roles, and this is just kind of a bit of a setup for talking about how the school itself is going to be imagined, it will be constructed, what it'll be up to, is that there are 3 major roles for systemic designers. And one is Wayfinder, that's the navigators. And then another one is Pathfinders, those are the guides. And the third is the designers or creators, the makers, the ones who actually bring something into existence, into the material world. So how to help people get good at being navigators and guides and designers, producers, makers, is what the intention of the school is kind of filling out those roles. And those are quite different from what you'll find in traditional design courses, programs around the world. I call those programs, they're solution schools, they're not design schools. Somebody has already decided that architecture is the solution, or a poster is the solution, or something else. It's already decided. They have a school for that solution. But the important piece is then really, what is it that we want to bring into existence and why? And how do we get there? And how do we do that collectively? And that's what these other roles are about. That's why this is a systemic design school and not a solution school.
Harold, can you give a short preview of what you're going to cover in the third presentation?
Yeah, what I wanted to do, hopefully in the third presentation, is to talk a bit about this sort of using this design flight school as a kind of a metaphor, but it's more than just a metaphor. It's actually a structural sort of template that can be used so that in the school, training and learning occur at the same time. Most schools focus on training. So you have expected outcomes when you give all the input into the student, and when you ask them to perform, or the chatbot, whichever is working, ask them to perform, then you get what is expected. You see that they got the right answer. And in the learning part for the designer is you get the expected unexpected. So what you find them is they have the capacity to do something greater than you would have expected, given the inputs that you had offered them. So anyway, this notion of this school, it's going to be like a flight school. It's going to have these different kinds of experiences, different sorts of learning experiences, preparations, experiential learning, as well as theoretical learning, in the same way as you learn to fly a plane, until you get to the point where you can go out on your own and work on projects, maybe with some guidance and some overview with somebody sort of mentoring by your side. So we'll talk a little more about this kind of structure, but it's a very powerful structure. It's powerful in that, as the first slide showed, if you don't know how to fly, there's consequences that could be serious. And it's very complex, demanding, but rewarding sort of process. And you need to pay attention to it. And the thing about the design flight schools are that you can go through at the level that you want to, so you can learn to fly single engine plane during daylight, no instruments, And then you can slowly begin to work yourself up through, go back through some flight school training, education, and you get to the point where you can use instruments, you can fly multi-engines, then you can do the next level where you can start to carry well, jet engines, you can do carry people, you can do, a lot more responsibility, accountability. Same thing can happen, you can imagine happening with a design flight school. So you can cycle through and grow through levels of accountability, responsibility, challenge. So it's not like a one-shot thing where you go through, you're handed a diploma and said, okay, go out and you're finished and you can go do this. It's not that at all. This is kind of going through training. It's a lifelong process, not necessarily in the school, but it starts a lifelong learning process where you get better and better at being a scholar practitioner.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Harold. If you could stop sharing the screen. Folks, it's time for Q&A. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark in order to ask questions. We're going to start with Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, Harold. Very much appreciate the time and the presentation. So it was fantastic. I mean, so I'm just kind of, there's one question I'm trying to still work out in my mind, but the first one I would like to ask you about is maybe if you could just clarify reason verifies viability. And the reason I'm asking that is I'm thinking about it in terms, I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly, is that I'm thinking about it in terms of the way you discussed design judgment. Because many times when I talk to people about reason and verifies what they determine to be viable, it often turns into a justification or rationale, then rather than using something where something thinking about it deeper, like through a design judgment. So I just want to make sure, is that what you mean by reason verifies viability? Because that's a very difficult thing to break. It's a very challenging thing to break, I will add, but it's anyway, I just wanted to clarify.
No, that's a good point. And that's a place where it goes deep in a hurry. So reason in this instance is not meant rationalize, and it really does include judgment and all those other things. It's the bigger notion of what inquiry is all about and how you engage in inquiry. And so there's no, in a short sort of little bumper sticker kind of thing, it's hard to find a word that really captures all of that, an English word anyway, but you're exactly right that it does mean much more than just rationalizing what you're doing or what you want to do. It's not meant to do that, mean that at all. And you could say scientists determine, but then that limits again just to a certain kind of reasoning. So it's like thinking, maybe would be another word, but that's kind of broad for people. They wouldn't get it. So I'm glad you picked that up though, but that's an important point.
Yeah, I think it, ooh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think it's one of the most important points, one chapters in the book is design judgment.
Yeah.
And so that this is kind of getting to that much, deeper point. So I that's why I was wanting to clarify. Actually, am I allowed to ask another question, or should we wait?
Folks, if you have got questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Joe, go ahead.
So I really think it's incredibly powerful the way you presented the industrial enterprise and how things are done and thought about now, and how we're going to move to this new paradigm of service. And so I was just thinking, how do you see that I mean, you went over some of the points, but specifically, how do you see that transitioning taking place? So do you see it in a sense of that you go into an organization and you see the transition from that perspective, or do you see this as something bigger, as a transition, like almost, you know, economically speaking, like, you know, that kind of real systemic change? It's from the practical aspect. How do you see that transition from I think it's a brilliant point because we're moving in that direction. And I especially think it's a very important point that you brought up specifically. If people are afraid of things like chatbots and, you know, these tools, because they have a right to be. They've been in this industrial enterprise, and so now they're limited, and there's, you know, it's difficult to move to that service based. Anyway,
Yeah.
anyway.
So I had a friend, colleague, who got a Nobel Prize in chemistry for working with unstable systems. And we talked a lot because I was trying to use his idea of systems that are far from equilibrium being very vulnerable to a very small spike, noise spike, and that these systems, when a noise spike hit them, they would go into chaos, and then they would come back at a higher level of organization and complexity. That's what he got his Nobel for. And his name is Prigogine, by the way, if you wanted to look. He's got a book, Order Out of Chaos, that's pretty accessible. So what he really liked about my idea that I brought to him was that social systems, a lot of them are far from equilibrium. They're very vulnerable to ideas. And we can see that happening nowadays with these sort of extremists coming in and making cases. So it's like, how do we, the thing about in his world, these noise spikes, just something that happened, and they never knew what the system was going to emerge like. They only knew it was going to be more complex. So I said, what I want to know, Ilya, is do you think it's possible that we could design a spike that was packed with information that could go into a social system, and what would emerge from the chaos, the upset, would be a higher level of complexity that we want, that we desire? So that's like one strategy for design, and it happens. I mean, we've got these ideas that have hit societies and have transformed them totally. It's, you know, the Christian tradition with Jesus, and that there's this spike, this one idea that sort of transforms everything because it was ready. So that's one way. I believe that education is essential. That's just why the school is important. Traditional schools aren't going to do this, and they're very difficult to change or influence because the way they reward themselves is not based on this parameters at all. It's based on something entirely different. But education is important. Writing, talking, influencing is very important. And there's some point, I like to use this example of going from a geocentric to solar-centric mapping of the solar system. I don't know if you've seen them or not, but if you see when we make maps with the geocentric point, there's all these strange retrogrades and things that go on, and they look, the maps look really terrible. When they changed to solar centric, everything kind of eased out and smooth, and we suddenly have this kind of aesthetic cohesive piece. And I see people now struggling, like I talked about the ESG thing, the environment, social governance movement that's going on now, and all these others, where people are trying to move from this 20th century approach into the 21st century approach, but not having changed their fundamental paradigm. Once that can happen, once you can shift to this just systemic design centric approach, things will even out. Things will become much more ordered and easy, and we can do this. And so the money and energy and time going into STEM or even STEAM for educational purpose isn't going to get us there if we don't allow systemic design to come in, because it's about design. It's about creating these things. It's not about describing and explaining it. And what they're trying to do is create desired outcomes, but through describing and explaining traditions, not through action traditions. So all those things are important, and we have to get at the highest level possible of conversation. Like, you're not going to tell probably or influence anybody at Davos, but there's got to be some place that you can go and get an audience and talk with people and begin to influence them and to shift this. Sorry to go on about this forever, but there's another important piece. I just finished an article where I used this. There's a movie called, American movie called Thin Red Line. And in one of the images, this soldier is marching into the center of the island, and an indigenous warrior hunter walks past and doesn't see him, doesn't recognize, doesn't see him, because the soldier is so out of the experience tradition of that hunter that he just can't see it. And cognitively, we're blind in that way, in a lot of ways. I'm sure I am still too in a lot of ways, but I tell people there could be aliens living amongst us and we would never see them because they would just be so strange. They're out of our cognitive frame. We couldn't appreciate it. In a way, when you go in to another company, institution or something, and you try to tell people, well, this is the systemic approach and this is what you need to do and how you need to frame, they can't see you. You're totally out of their cognitive frame. They can't see you. They're the hunter-gatherer just walking past this thing that they just can't recognize. So that's a part of it. And to engage in conversations when and where necessary to get people to begin to see that it's a possibility, that this is maybe a good idea, and then to be able to demonstrate, because I'm positive that it'll make a huge difference. Positive.
Thank you, Harold. Folks, I have tons of questions for Harold, but I'm going to give your questions priority. So, Harold, the most intriguing quote that I found in this particular presentation is, "The design mind takes us to where we have never been, but desire to be." Can you talk a little bit about the design mind?
Yeah, I've been very interested. I mean, one of the things that we started talking about early on, like in the design way and all that, is that we designed fire, we didn't discover it. And to keep going back, what was it that made us do those things? What was it in us that pulled us into these future things? And we weren't pushed into it. I mean, none of these things that were great breakthroughs, like these beautiful temples or whatever that's been done historically, was done because it's a problem. Somebody had a problem. They had a desire. They wanted to do something. And the design mind seems to be the thing that pulls us into the future. Singer, one of Churchman's influencers, said it was dissatisfaction, continual dissatisfaction. We were always dissatisfied. That didn't mean that we were always had problems. It's just we're always dissatisfied. So this is like, well, it isn't really dissatisfaction. It's a whole other thing that's going on that's pulling us forward. It's the call that Joseph Campbell talks about. It's the thing that pulls us into the future rather than us getting pushed into the future, or we run away from the present or something like that. And it's interesting. They just announced a huge find that they found a factory for making flint axes, and they had never, it's 100,000 years older than they had imagined we were making. And it's not modern humans. It was another earlier group that was doing it. The design mind has been around a long time, and probably is, I mean, but there's something there. There's something that pulls us. And when we desire to be someplace else, it's something, it's like lame gods in the service of prosthetic gods. We always want to be more than we were born with. We always want to be different, to be faster, to be whatever. And designers are the ones that enable that. They help people become more than they were born with, and we're limited, like Hephaestus, we're limited in what we can do, but we are in the service with of people who want to be more, who want to have more augmentations, to make them more than they were. And the design mind, I believe, is something that's continually evolving. And as we say, well, we want to be able to do this more, or it'll respond. I mean, we'll develop it even more.
Thank you, Harold. Next up is going to be Robert. Robert, feel free to make any comments that you want, any questions, please go ahead.
Am I on? Turned on? I was reflecting on what Joe was asking about and what Harold had mentioned about Prigogine and his idea of societies or cultures being in transition or inequality or non-equilibrium, and more or less constantly. And it seems to me that we're probably in one of those transition periods now where we have this industrial complex that at one time was an attractor. It was giving a lot more than it was taking, and it had a lot of pull behind it. And over the years, it's aged and modified itself into several different kinds of industrial enterprise. Then it becomes less attractive because it's being threatened by the incipient social, cultural happenings that are coming on the scene. So it gets very defensive and starts taking measures not to be creative in the desiderata context, but in the preservation context in order to stay together. And so to put it pictorially, we're kind of on the ocean between the nascent and the incipient with our culture at this point, and the culture is ready to find an alternative, and there are alternatives already being proposed, but they're the old ones that never worked in the first place.
Harold, would you like to comment on that, please?
Well, I think it's true. I agree. I have this feeling that there's a lot of instability for a lot of reasons, more than I could imagine just even a year ago. It gets to other levels. It's like, where do we know how to design the spike of information that will come in and perturb them? And how do we sort of pack that with the kind of information that we want, that sort of thing? As designers, part of what we need to do as designers, practitioners, scholars, is to talk about those things. So how do we actually get the work done? How do we transform the environment that we need so that then we can behave as systemic designers? How do we create the academy and written large? How do we do that? How do we create something that the crucible that will protect and hold us? And it's like a culture of design and the design culture. How do we protect the environment? How do we create the environment? And how do we do that? And I think the time is right now for sure. And we can't afford to miss the opportunity for a lot of reasons. I think it's like really have to take advantage. And it's interesting, people that I run across that had never heard or anything about this, and talk to them for a bit, they say, wow, really? It's like they don't have it. They don't have the information where they can even imagine that there's a difference, that there's somebody walking right by them. They don't have that ability. The cognitive blindness is stuck, in the mind maps that we've got, all that. So yeah.
The water for the
Yeah.
next up is going to be Becky. Becky, go ahead.
I have a very straightforward question. How do you distinguish between Wayfinder, Pathfinder, and Designer? Is this on a spectrum? And how can you tell when one is masking as the other?
So mostly the way that I see it anyways, the navigators are the ones that are the navigating skills, are the kind that skills necessary for us to move along a course and to encounter all kinds of things as we're going along, avoid dangers, doing that, changing winds, whatever. We have that capacity. The guide capacity is that I use the South Pacific navigators a lot because I really, really like what they've done. But they could navigate from one tiny little piece of land in this huge, huge ocean to another tiny piece of land. But not only could they do that, they were guides in that they could recognize atmospheric conditions and things that would tell them that there is an island there, a tiny island, and they could get you to that island because they had the skills to know what the outcome was going to be. They could read patterns, they could read the flights of birds and all that. So the navigators could steer and take advantage of the wind and the currents and all that. The guides could understand what the signals were that were coming from the environment, what was telling you, so that if you knew that this is the kind of thing that you wanted to do, like another island, they could get you there. And then the designers, like once you hit the island, how do you create a community? How do you design, build a community? How do you populate that space and create the kind of space that you want to have in particular? And love this term. We don't have good terms in English anymore. We've lost a lot of them around design. But demiurge was an old term, Greek term, and it was the craftsman that made reality. And of course, they advanced that, expanded that to a kind of a god that did the material world, and then a bigger god that did everything else. But it was this notion of the materiality and the one who creates the material. And it was like the craft people and things like that, the ones who made the temples, who made the ships, who did those kind of things. And we don't have we have designer, but it's not, it's kind of a weak case of that notion of bringing something into reality that's really a powerful idea. So did that answer your question, Becky?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Harold, I want to point out this dramatic contrast between two of your slides and have you comment on it. Look at the 20th century zeitgeist. First, science finds, second, industry applies, and third, man adapts. And I see the contrast between that and the design postulate freedoms. Free choice to choose the stance, free will, choose to be intentional, choosing a direction, epistemic freedom, choose form of inquiry, choosing approach, and ontological freedom, choose intention, choosing purpose. Can you comment on this dramatically different worldviews here?
Yeah. The 20th century zeitgeist says, no, you don't have those freedoms. No. You'll do what you're told, or, you don't, those don't, and there's tons, I run across it all, tons written by people saying there's no such thing as free will or free choice or free anything. However, if you've ever been a designer, you know that there's a free choice and free will. So you need, as designers, to be in the 21st century zeitgeist where that's accepted and people understand that that's a responsibility and you're accountable for that. And that's what you do, you need to do. So yeah, it's dramatically different. And it's like, it's why you can't convince people who are in the 20th century zeitgeist that there is free will and you're a designer and you do that. No, you know, you don't. No, you don't. That's not possible. So yeah, it's huge. I mean, it's dramatically huge, which is a reason why you sort of, it's difficult. It's when people want to bring you in to do something, you have to go back and sort of explain to them what the differences are going to be, what are the habits and expectations they have that are going to be challenged, so they can see you, instead of just pass you by and say, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another way of putting it is that the view of human beings, this is a profoundly opposite view of human beings. The 20th century view is that human beings are these cogs in this giant machine, and the giant machine is the primary thing, and these are just cogs that need to fit in the right place. Otherwise, why are they there? The opposite view makes human beings as being the center, the source of all creation. So it's a dramatically different, opposite view of human beings.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. Folks, if you have more questions, go ahead and type ! Joe.
Mine's a very simple question. It's more of actually just making sure I'm applying thinking about the design way in the proper context, in the sense that, do you see the flight school as kind of the ultimate particular within the context and that's the way I'm thinking about it? So in terms of, you have your Desiderata, you have your, you're setting it, and then you have your basically your parte, if I did say that correct. Yeah. And then you can go there, and then you iterate from there, obviously. But essentially, I just wanted to make sure that how you see it within the ecosystem, and then this just starting out, and then hopefully it can upend conventional wisdom from there.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's very much an ultimate particular, and hopefully it'll be part of a larger particular where people will sort of share that this is one outcome of this new paradigm, and there can be others, and people are not shy about telling me, yeah, that's a great idea, but I got this idea. So it's fine. The only thing that and why it's so important to go through this planning with the school for these particular clients, or with the surrogate clients, helping to make sure it's a service for them, is that there's an infinite number of ways that we can go, directions we can go, and outcomes that we can find. So what's important to us? We make that choice. We decide, we make the judgment about what's important, what's valuable, who's valuable to serve, what kind of world do you want to see, and then we take the stand and we do it, which is why courage and all the rest of that is so important, because you're doing something in particular in a world that worships the general universal in one level, or wants to disagree with you because it doesn't serve their clients or their purpose or in the way they want. But I think there's possibilities where we can have alliances in that, and people can be doing things that support and bring this notion of the human-centered service into existence and surprise us. That's great. That's beautiful. It's like going to a show at a museum, and you don't go in to see which is the true picture. You go in to appreciate them all, and you get this aesthetic experience, having seen all of them, appreciated them, seen what it's like. Cultures, all the rest, it's like one culture is not necessarily better than the other, but I've seen, you know, like some dances in different cultures were just startling. And I say, God, you know, those are done by human beings like me, but look at what they've done. That's amazing. That's just amazing. And yeah, it's that. I think the ultimate particulars in this case are important. And this is a stab at doing an ultimate particular of taking it.
Thank you. Thank you, Harold. Many of the folks who are listening to this on YouTube, these concepts, desiderata, parte, and ultimate particulars, are developed fully in Harold's book, The Design Way. But Harold, if you could just briefly talk about what these three concepts mean, so people who are not familiar with it can understand what they're about.
So what was the three?
Desiderata, parte, and ultimate particular.
Can we have another three?
You know, if you go down that route, Harold, I have Design Way open here, and three, I can give you 12 if you want. Go ahead.
So, of course, there's a lot more to this notion of desiderata is what we desire, not what frightens us, what are we angry at, what we're afraid of, only this. So what is it that we desire? And people aren't very good about thinking and expressing that. So when I've worked with groups, for instance, and particularly in large social planning groups, they can tell you endlessly what's broken, what scares them, what makes them angry, what really pisses them off. But when you ask them, well, what is it that you would like? What would be desirable? It's always, well, I don't like that thing because it's not working, or I don't like them because they're not, you know, it's never really. So desiderata isn't something that's well developed in us, but it's essential. It's a piece of the design mind. It's connected with the design mind. What do we want to be pulled towards? And it may not even be entirely visible to us, like a problem, you know, so the thing that we hate and that. And God knows, after the news recently, there's enough of that kind of stuff, that energy in the world, that it's just almost overwhelming. So desiderata is an important piece to go back and really bring along, because it is part and parcel of the design mind, and it's sort of like reifying the design mind a bit. It says, okay, this is what it looks like. This is what we want to be pulled towards. How do we think about that?
Yeah, let me just elaborate a little bit. So what you're saying is that desiderata is the positive things that you're looking for instead of the negative things you're reacting to.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. What do you want to act towards? And it doesn't even have to be that clear. I mean, the design mind doesn't make us that clear. It just says, I want to go this direction. I would like to. And if you've been working on something, you know, you get pushed. If you're writing a book, or if you're doing whatever, any kind of creative work, you get pushed. And who's pushing me this? Well, something calling, pushing me to go in that direction. The ultimate particular, that was the other one.
Yes.
Is this notion ultimate particular deals with, it's totally context dependent. Like the universal and general are context independent. Like scientific knowledge, which is great, it's essential, but it doesn't it's not dictated by a context. Gravity is gravity no matter where you are. This planet, another planet, 100 years ago, 2,000 years from now, gravity is gravity. The particular for me is what we usually say, what's real. So what's now? What can you say is now? What's foreground, background? What's the real part of this? And it's context dependent. So our experiences and everything are context dependent. These ages are context dependent. They're particulars, industrial age and systemic design age. And the ultimate particular is like the singular, unique kind of the word I can't remember now. It stands on its own. It's context dependent, but it's not dependent on any of the other things around it for why it is what it is. I mean, it is in the environment of that, but not as how it displays itself or how it comes into existence in the form that it does. And we're also in our culture nowadays, we're not very familiar with ultimate particular because we're used to the manufacturing, the manufacturing of tons of stuff like computers and iPhones and cars and everything. And it's interesting always to me is how people personalize something that's very general and can be particular and make it an ultimate particular, make it theirs. So it's theirs, it's part of their life. It's a particular, and people want to be ultimate particulars, and we get treated as avatars all the time, or a statistical point, or, all the time. And people's desire is to be, I want to be treated like a unique individual who I am. That's what I would like to be. I don't want to be a part of a big crowd or a statistic or any of those things. I want to be me. I'm important. I count. And that's one of the habits that we have too, is we turn people almost immediately into statistics. Like, okay, 15 people have been shot now. Okay, that's 15 souls. That's 15 unique humans. That's not just a number that goes on a chart that you can go in and talk to somebody with a budget about. And partie is when you're going through a creative process, a particular kind of creative process, and it's very complex, and you're dealing with a lot of inputs and things. You go through these stages and phases. At some point, anybody that's done that kind of creative work, you'll always come to this point where there's an aha. No matter how complex, how complicated, how much stuff is going on, it'll coalesce into this particular seed idea. I say, okay, that's the design. It's not the design in full particular. It's not the design in detail or anything. It's like the essence of the design, the soul. And it's the thing that then you begin to work with and say, okay, as you prototype, and that says, does it look like this? No, that's not quite it. Well, does it look like, oh yeah, that's it. That's closer. So the partie is the very sort of essence, the soul of a design. And it's usually comes to us maybe through several of them, but primarily it comes as a kind of a flash, an insight. You're stepping on the bus is one particular famous example. Guy stepping on the bus and suddenly has this breakthrough insight about this huge mathematical challenge that's happening. Yeah, or you're in the shower. I mean, there's 100 ways, you're not paying attention. It's suddenly, oh, yeah, and that's it. And architects are famous for their partie sketches where they have some squiggles or some little things that they're doing, and that's the essence of their building. Doesn't look like they're building or anything, but it's the essence, and they get it, and they hold it and begin to develop it. So,
so it's the seed from which the entire design flowers. So one last question, kind of stepping back and looking at systems thinking and systems design. who are some of your heroes? I know you talk a lot about Russ Ackoff. So Russ Ackoff or anybody else, what are the predecessors of system design that you really respect?
Yeah, of course, the one that really got me hooked into it, that it made sense to me for the first time, was Wes Churchman. And he wrote a book, a very sort of accessible little book called The Systems Approach. And I was always almost like a missionary at one point. I was out handing these copies of the Systems Approach out to people at universities and other places, because very simple idea, but it was something that people didn't have. So I would say he would be at the top of the list. And in addition to Russ Ackoff, there would be people like Len Duell, who is a medical doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, and he made a huge shift in the culture, by the way. He redefined health away from doctors and medicines to health in this larger sense of quality of life. And he started the largest program in the United Nations that's in existence called Healthy Cities. And he was hugely influenced, and he did it with a seed. He had the seed idea of health is not doctors and medicine. Health is, and all these countries all over the world, North and South, Southern hemispheres, all took the idea and expressed it in their own ways, what that meant, what health meant to them. That wasn't a doctor and medicine. So he was very influential to me for that. Of course, Horst Riddle was a big influence. And then the whole history, and I would tell people to go back and sort of look at from this perspective of Wes Churchman, of that, at writings where the point is to bring things together, not analyze them, not separate them out, not break them apart. And literally, when I've gone back and looked at writings like the I Ching and that, from that perspective, they made a whole lot of sense to me in that way, in a different way. They were designs. Somebody designed a system that made sense for doing a certain thing back then, way back then, before TV, before AI. They did this huge, beautiful thing. So I have a lot of sort of ancestors in that listed on my website. I have a library piece where I put in a lot of the people that influenced me in different ways. And the thing now is that there was systems and there was design, and it's like West and Horst and all of them would kind of mix up planning and design and not have it kind of separated out. But there's some great material designers that I have known as well that have influenced me. So bringing them together now in this new way as systemic design where it's integrated, I'm sure West, well, I'm not positive, but West and the others would appreciate this notion of that's what a system is. It's a design. And West himself said, there are no systems that exist naturally. They're all the way that somebody defines them. The designer decides what's going to be called a system. And this is the boundary, and this is what it is. You don't have natural system. So I think he would have appreciated this notion of bringing design, composing, creating, putting things together and getting there, the navigation and the guides. How do we get? Because the answer isn't in the answer is not at the end of the book. The answer is what we decide it is as we go out in a direction we want to go and determine what kind of outcome we want to see. So it's a search. It's kind of a quest. Anyway.
I want to connect up one more idea that we've dealt with here. You talked about this gentleman who talked about the healthy cities. Take the idea of health. Okay, there is a really kind of foundational book called Why We Get Sick, written by a collaboration between really one of the top evolutionary biologists, George C. Williams, and a doctor. And it's really, when I read it the first time, I was stunned. The point that they are making is that the entire field of medicine has developed without looking at evolution and without looking at the nature of human beings. It is all about the billiard ball model, saying that I know if I throw this at this effect, people will temporarily feel better. And that's how it has developed mostly. And what they are saying is that, no, you need to look at the being and the system that you are trying to make healthy. It's not about fixing disease. It is about making things healthy. So I see a lot of parallels between that approach and your work. Any
Yeah.
thoughts?
It's the notion of I think it's Russ Akoff that said, if you get a headache, you don't cut your head off.
Yes.
Find out what's causing it, and and you go out to the different, not the approximate cause, but you go, or approximate cause, but you go to the root causes and things like that. But in every other setting, we all cut off our heads. We're all doing that kind of thing, and we're doing it with homelessness. We're doing it with all the things going on now in societies. We're cutting heads off, or hands, because we've got an owie in here and it aches, instead of going and looking at nervous systems and diets and exercise and all the other things. So yeah, it's amazing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harold. So folks, don't miss the third installment of Harold's presentation on the detailed how of the design school. Harold, I'll give you the final word. What would you like to end with?
Well, I just want to, again, appreciate everybody's time and attention, and whatever feedback that you want to give me, feel free. My email, I think you've posted a few times, nelsongroup@cal.berkeley.edu. I appreciate that. If, for instance, what Joe was asking about earlier, if there's another word that's better and defines, I love words that get crafted, and reclaiming words that we've lost because of the drift that we've been through for the last few centuries. So if there's another word for thinking or rationalizing or whatever, share it with folks. So anyway, those kind of feedback, all of them are appreciated, and just keep attached to the development of the school, because it's moving forward. It's going to become real. I'll be doing some master classes myself as kind of a warm-up. Other people are doing them just to see what's working, what's not working. And so it's self-organizing, we hope, that it starts to come together, and we want to include the people that really would like to be or want to be a part of in any way that they can, because it takes more than a village. It takes more than an institute to make the school.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harold. Folks, the website is www.haroldgnelson.com. And again, the email address is nelsongroup@cal.berkeley.edu. It's there in the chat. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate all your thoughtful questions and comments. We will see you 1 week from today on Saturday, next Saturday. See you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you.